Welcome to the Wander in Germany podcast. Your host is the founder of the Wander in Germany travel blog and the Travel in Bavaria Facebook group, Leanna Brown.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Wander in Germany podcast. I'm your host, Leanna Brown, from the Germany travel blog, Wander in Germany. Today, it's all about setting the expectations for what hotels are really like in Germany. Now, last week, we talked about the different kinds of accommodations, like hotels versus pensions versus Ferienwohnungen versus Airbnbs versus Kinderhotels. We went into all of that. So if you missed it, it was a pretty short episode, so make sure you go back and listen to last week's episode. Today, we're going to be setting the realistic expectations of what hotels are like, because they are going to be different than what you might be used to. And then, of course, next week, I'm going to go all into how I personally book accommodations for Germany. So kind of consider this a 3-part accommodation journey. So today, there's nothing necessarily groundbreaking about our conversation, but I can't tell you the amount of travelers that I've talked to that comment on how surprised they were with the differences between hotels that they're used to staying in, for example, in the US, versus Germany, and quite honestly, most of Europe. These come down to cultural differences, but also just differences in expectations. So most of the time, it's not that travelers are necessarily mad about the situation or the amenities. It's just that they weren't expecting it, or they were at least expecting something different, so it took them off guard. Now, nothing is necessarily wrong or bad about these differences, but if you go into the hotels in Germany thinking they're going to be just like what you're used to in the US, you are going to get quite a surprise. So today, it's more about setting the right expectations so that you are just fully prepared for the German hotel experiences. Now, before I get into this episode, I do just want to make a very loud and clear declaration. Okay. Just because I am mentioning something today about the hotels in Germany doesn't mean that this is the hard and fast rule, okay? So of course there are going to be exceptions. So do not come at me being like, that's not true, Leanna. The hotels I stayed at all had X, Y, and Z. Like, okay, thank you, Linda. I appreciate that you had a different experience at the 2 hotels you stayed at on your trip in Germany, but I have lived in Germany now for almost 10 years. My job as a Germany travel blogger is literally to travel and then help others travel to Germany. So I have been to so many hotels in Germany that I can say I understand the general norms pretty well. Okay, with that out of the way, before you begin searching for and booking hotels, these are the things that I think you need to at least be aware of because it can actually help you in your search process. So if any of these issues that I'm going to talk about today are of a concern to you, the easiest way to make sure you are getting a hotel that meets your needs is to double check the details on whatever booking platform you use. Or better yet, even a quick email to the hotel will probably be your best option for certainty. And also remember that just because another country typically does something different from what you are used to, that's all it is, different. After all, aren't we traveling to foreign countries to experience and learn about other cultures? I mean, granted, who knew that bedding would be such a controversial travel topic? But alas, here we are. So again, none of this is me implying that German hotels are bad. They're just sometimes, and not always, but sometimes different than what an average traveler might expect. So the first thing we need to talk about in differences is the topic of air conditioning. So it's true. Most German hotels, now aside from the large chain hotels like Marriott's, Hilton's, etc., will probably not have AC. I can't tell you the amount of people that flock to our Facebook groups each August, absolutely in an uproar about the AC conversation. If I didn't know better, I might be led to believe that they were actually melting. Now, as like a little sidebar, I personally think that German seasons are somewhat quote unquote mild. Now, that's my little humble opinion, but let me explain myself. So if you've been around here for a while, you know I'm from Nebraska. And it's the norm for the majority of the summer months, like May through August, to be extremely hot and humid. I mean, we're talking Fahrenheit, 80 to 90 degrees norm, with oftentimes wretched humidity, leaving us in the heat indexes of, well into 100, if not more degrees. Well, that's 38 degrees Celsius. So when I say that I think German summers are quote unquote mild, I guess take that with a grain of salt and perspective, because obviously if you come from a place that isn't that warm, if you come to Germany and it is in the 90s and there's not air conditioning, yeah, it might take you off guard. However, all that being said, I have had more German summers where it has been June and it's been rainy, it's been cool, like in the 60 degrees-ish, that's like 16 degrees Celsius, and I have literally had sweatshirts on just to stay warm. Let's just say that my very first summer in Germany, when I was armed with my summer tank tops, I was in for quite a shock when I needed to go buy extra sweatshirts and long pants. Now, the reality is that, July, even in June, you can often get really beautiful summer days where it's 70s, 80s, like just absolutely perfect for strolling around, wandering. And I do understand that for some people, even in the 80 degrees, so again, we're talking like 23 to 29-ish degrees Celsius, can feel hot if you're not used to that kind of weather. Now, August in Germany usually does tick up a little bit. There's often a little bit more humidity, but rarely do you see temperatures that break over 100 degrees, and that's 38 degrees Celsius. Now, I will be completely honest with you. This trend that I just said is beginning to change. So, thanks, hashtag global warming. And yes, like the reality is we are beginning to get a few more heat waves here in Europe than even when I moved to Germany the first time in 2011. But the reality is that even when we do get a heat wave, and yes, it can get pretty hot during those heat waves, especially since there's not air conditioning, the reality is it's almost never more than about 10 days at a time, which, yes, I understand can be your entire vacation, but that's one of the main reasons why it's just not very cost effective for hotels and houses and buildings here in Germany to have AC. I mean, when we're only looking at a few weeks each summer that would even require it, it's really not worth it. Now, there's a whole plethora of other reasons that I go into on my actual blog post about this topic, about German hotels and air conditioning. And if you want to read more about why the costs aren't worth it to most people, because there's other reasons too. Like, for example, it's actually illegal in some old historical buildings. And also the fact that the buildings here are built much differently than in the US, and therefore it's kept much cooler in the summer. So basically what that entire rambling part of me talking was is just basically do not assume that your hotel has AC. In fact, unless it specifically states somewhere that it does have AC, just assume that it doesn't. Now, all that being put aside, I understand that there are some people that just don't like or can't handle heat very well, and that's fine. Just know that you're going to have to do maybe a little bit more research. I mean, it's not very hard though, to ensure that you're going to be booking hotels that have AC. Because yes, they do exist. They're just, again, not the norm. Also know that you'll probably be paying a pretty penny for those hotels that have air conditioning, as it is kind of seen as a luxury here. If you absolutely need air conditioning, again, go with those chain hotels, the Hyatts, the Marriotts, things like that. They're going to have air conditioning. Now, what's funny is on the flip side of all of this, many people then start to panic about heating in the winter. So no, Germany is not a third world country. Yes, there is proper heating. In fact, most people comment that German hotels are so hot in the winter, oddly enough, that they often find themselves even opening up the windows to stay cool at night. Now, I actually tend to agree with this statement. So again, it's just something to think about when packing your pajamas. Maybe just have a few different options in your luggage. Now, the next sweeping statement about hotels in Germany is that the vast majority, again, aside from those big international chains, of hotels typically don't have elevators. Now, sometimes this isn't a big deal if it's just a 1 or 2 floor situation in like a small pension, but sometimes you find yourself in an Airbnb in Berlin, for example, having to climb a high-rise building, or that super cute boutique hotel you booked, in a old half-timbered building only has stairs to the 6th floor. So obviously, if you have mobility issues, this can be a real concern. The other thing that people don't think about when they talk about no elevators is the kind of luggage you bring. So if you're bringing a giant suitcase, are you willing to lug it up 6 floors? Just a thought. Speaking of maybe complaints, another common complaint I hear from travelers, particularly in the cities, is noise. So remember, since most hotels aren't going to have AC, if you're coming in the summer, that means you're going to want your windows open at night. This is where reviews are vital. I can't stress that enough. Now, a lot of time, this isn't a huge issue. But for example, let's say you're staying in a lively section of an Altstadt, then, there might be a pub nearby that's loud. Or many times, Airbnbs are a floor above restaurants, which might get loud. Again, this is more about having the right expectations in these situations so that you can just go in with the right frame of mind. Of course, I personally never travel without earplugs and an eye mask, just in case I get to a hotel that does have more noise than what I was expecting. Another small but interesting difference to bring up is the pool situations in most German hotels, or lack thereof. So when I was a kid, I loved going to hotels, but mostly because there was almost always a good chance that there would be a pool. However, it's extremely hard to find pools at hotels in Germany unless it's at like a Kinder hotel or a wellness hotel. Again, occasionally something like a Marriott might have one, but even then, it's not a guarantee like it often is in the US. So again, not a huge deal, but just something to consider if you have kids who just assume that going to a hotel equals pool time. All right, so now I want to talk about the rooms of hotels themselves. While there are still a few things you need to know for the purpose of booking, I just wanted to bring up the rest of these because it's often the topic of friendly debates in my Facebook groups. The first thing you need to know about not just German, but most European hotel rooms is that they're actually often quite small in comparison to what you might be used to in the US. Some are, extremely cozy, let's call it. But for the most part, they're enough space for the purpose of having a place to sleep. It's just not really a place that you can socialize much in. But yes, be prepared for rooms to be slightly smaller than in the US. Now, let's talk about the beds. This is actually a really funny, interesting, and common topic that is brought up about German hotels. So first, the sizes of beds. This is particularly important when you go to book hotels. You need to know that they don't really do twin, queen, and king sizes here. So what you'll most likely find at hotels are a single bed, and this is really like the closest to a twin bed in the US, and double beds. And the double beds are typically 2 singles, hence the double name, pushed together. The total size is kind of roughly between a queen and a king, and there are large double beds, and I would say these are probably closest to what I would say a king is. But again, these are 2 singles pushed together. You might be wondering why I'm kind of emphasizing this, but the first thing I want to touch on here are these double beds. I know I've said this multiple times, so I'm going to say it again. They're literally 2 beds pushed together. That means that there's usually this big crack down the middle, and I personally hate them because, I'll be honest, I'm a cuddler and it's just not very conducive to cuddling. Also, because, I have kids, this means that if any of my kids inevitably crawl into bed with me, and one of them will inevitably crawl into bed with me, then someone, most likely me, ends up sleeping in or on this crack. The reality is that there's really no way around this though, and it's just the way the beds are made here, particularly at hotels. I know it sounds kind of like a silly thing to stress on, but I can't tell you how many people are like, what is going on with the bed situation? Now, I also personally find German beds a little bit hard, but this is obviously completely opinion based. And I've learned over time that apparently I like my beds much softer than most people. So again, take that with a grain of salt, like my comment on the heat. Now, one thing that most traveling families or groups really struggle with when it comes to European hotels is the bed setup situation. So in the US, you almost always see rooms that have an option of 2 queen beds. This literally does not exist in Europe. There aren't queen beds. Now, you might be able to find a hotel that maybe has 2 double beds, but again, these are basically slightly larger than twin size beds. Now, you might be able to find a hotel that has a double bed, and if it's not one of these that are pushed together, it's just basically a large twin size bed. This makes finding hotels with families extremely difficult. Now, I'm the youngest of 4 kids, so when we traveled as a child, that meant that even with a room with 2 queen beds, I usually got the sleeping bag on the floor. However, Europe has rules on reporting maximum number of people per room, and they're actually very strict about this. And if they find out that you have a kiddo on the floor that you didn't report, you can get kicked out. So basically what I'm saying is this makes staying at hotels very difficult with families. You usually have to get a separate room. There are family rooms in some hotels, but they're usually very expensive. And it's just frustrating knowing that the US does have options of 2 queen beds. That makes it so much easier. But alas, again, this is where I talk about expectations. Now that I know that this is the expectation, I don't get frustrated by it because it's just how it is. In fact, speaking of traveling with families, in a few weeks, I'm actually going to have an entire episode about traveling with families in Germany. And I'll also go into exactly what I do for finding accommodation that works for our family of 5 when we travel. So you know what that means. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure you do that so you get those notifications for when all those future episodes go out, especially if you're a family traveling in Germany for that particular episode. But speaking of booking accommodations, next week, I'm going to be showing you and talking about exactly how I typically book hotels in Germany. So of course, you need to be subscribed for that as well. The last thing I'll bring up, just as a so you know kind of thing, are the pillows and duvets. And again, you probably hear me laughing in my voice because it sounds like a silly thing, but you do need to be aware of it before going into the hotel rooms. So you are either going to love this system or hate it. So here's the deal. So remember, these beds are usually just single beds put together. Well, when this is the case, you'll also find that instead of one big comforter, there's actually 2 separate, single duvets. They're usually very thick, very warm, made out of a down filling. And if you couldn't tell from earlier when I talked about the cracks and everything, I don't love the whole separate part of the bed situation. But I have heard so many people who got home from Germany and legit completely redid their beds at home to get 2 singles and individual duvets because they loved it so much. So to each his own. I guess I can see it, especially if you have a partner who has a different bed preference to you. So you each get a single of your, preference of softness to hardness, and you push it together. And yeah, I guess I can see it for that sake. But what most foreigners and travelers do agree about is the pillows suck. I'm sorry, I have to be honest. Again, this is typically with this double bed situation, but these are huge square pillows, usually of some down type of filling. And within minutes, this giant pillow is completely flat and completely uncomfortable. And you might be thinking, well, if it's so huge, why not fold it in half? Okay, sure. But now I just have a small rectangle of hard, flat pillow. I know some people who hate the pillow situation so much they actually travel with their own travel pillow. Now, I personally don't go that far, but yeah, again, it's just something to know about before you rest your sweet little head at night at the hotels in Germany. Again, really what this is all about is expectations. When you're going to book your hotel, you can't obviously filter out huge duvet pillows, right? However, when you get there, if you have that expectation of, oh, I remember Leanna saying these pillows are going to be uncomfortable, then suddenly you're not taken off guard. Speaking of expectations, let's talk about one of my favorite topics in general. You know what it is, food. So what can you expect from a German hotel breakfast? Well, the first is that you can expect nothing unless otherwise stated. Now, okay, granted, most hotels and most pensions all will offer a breakfast, but sometimes it is an extra charge. However, sometimes it's included. So basically just double check. And if you're using something like booking.com, there's actually a filter that you can click on that says breakfast included so that everything you look at has a breakfast included. So let's say you pick or find a hotel that does have a breakfast included. Then what you can expect is a typical, and by typical, I mean a very elaborate and amazing breakfast buffet and spread. If you're used to powdered eggs, maybe like a waffle machine and a watered down coffee at your continental breakfasts, be ready to fall in love with German breakfasts. So no German breakfast is complete without at least like 100 kinds of different breads. So take your pick of whatever fresh made Bäckerei Brot that you want, including, of course, things like pretzels. Now, at a hotel buffet, you'll almost always find like a spread of deli cut meats and cheeses. I usually make some sort of sandwich, like, yes, for breakfast out of these. So a few variations of salamis, maybe slices of hams. I put a cucumber on it, and I put some creme fraiche, which is kind of like the European version of cream cheese. And my favorite kind of bread roll to put it on is if they have a pumpkin seed roll. So good. And if I'm feeling hungry, I'll even throw an egg on there. And you've got yourself a breakfast Sammy. You'll also almost always find fresh fruits, some different yogurts, some muesli, which is kind of like an oats kind of mixture, and occasionally like cereal, but don't expect like super sugary kinds. So we're talking things like cornflakes. There's also almost always some kind of eggs and almost always a nice selection of different pastries. And then there's the coffee. I am spoiled for coffee after living in Europe for 10 years. But one of the reasons is because coffee machines are so common just about everywhere. Like so common that I fell in love with this style that I even just bought a real coffee machine for here at home. So yes, I'm very spoiled. So you want a latte, a cappuccino, an espresso? Have at it, because most likely the hotel that you're staying at has a machine that you just go click a button and voila, you've got yourself a delicious cappuccino. So yes, like hotel, pensions, those breakfasts are usually no small spread. So even if you're debating paying the €10 for breakfast, you'll most likely get your money's worth, especially if you're a big breakfast eater. So I'm actually going to wrap it up here. Basically, what I really want to stress about today is that nothing at a German hotel is hugely blatantly different than what you would expect in the US, aside from maybe the AC or the elevators. Oh, another thing to mention is don't expect ice machines anywhere. I mean, don't expect ice anywhere in Germany, but especially at the hotel. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that they're all a place to put your head, to sleep at night. There's nothing super fancy about a lot of the pensions. I mean, don't get me wrong. You can absolutely find luxury accommodations in Germany, and they are amazing, okay? But the reality is that if you just get a very normal pension or locally run type of mom and pop hotel, this is what you can expect. And as long as you know those expectations and you go into it with those expectations, things like no elevator, things like no AC suddenly doesn't take you off guard. And when you're not taken off guard, it doesn't feel as overwhelming. And you're just kind of like, oh yeah, like Leanna told me about this. This is what I expected it to be. And it just makes everything else feel much smoother. And my hope is that by listening to this episode today, that when it comes time to actually search for and book hotels, that you'll be well aware of what to expect so that you can pick the best hotel for you and know exactly what to look for in the reviews and descriptions. For example, if you know you need an AC in August, because that's who you are, that's totally fine. Just know that that's what you have to filter for. And I guess at the end of the day, you should just never assume that because you are used to something in what you might consider as standard hotels or something even like standard restaurant service, which don't worry, will be another episode also, that there can still be some cultural nuances that might catch you off guard. And like, that's just part of traveling. So as long as you have the right expectations going into it all, suddenly those 6 flight of stairs that you have to climb or the no AC in your room isn't a total downer and isn't even a deal breaker because you knew about it already instead of being taken off guard. Now, of course, I have all sorts of other insider tips, both on accommodations, but as well as just trip planning in general, all on the blog at wanderandgermany.com. So go over there to make sure that you're getting all those insider tips. And as always, as we start to near towards the end of what I'm calling season 1 here on the Wander in Germany podcast, as a new podcast, I truly appreciate every single one of you that likes and subscribes and comments and shares and, all of those above things to any of these podcasts. I genuinely hope that I was able to help you feel more at ease for your upcoming trip to Germany. And don't forget that if you want to see an unfiltered view of Germany, go ahead and head over to my Instagram, which is at wander.in.germany, where I love to show you the very beautiful, but also very real side of traveling in Germany with me. And if you know that you're going to be spending some time in Bavaria, you can also check out my Travel in Bavaria Facebook group, where me, locals, and other travelers all come in and help you plan your best trip to Germany possible. And then, sorry, but one more final call out. If you haven't yet, please consider signing up for my newsletter if you want specially curated info and deals straight to your inbox that will help you plan your trip like a pro with a pro to Germany. Thanks again, and until next time, bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss.